Moving on to chapter 3 now, the title of which is A Game of 90 Minutes. I see what he's been doing is just comparing it a lot to football games, all these little subtitles for the chapter. So chapter 3 is starting to get into the nuts and bolts of this, and it's quite a meaty chapter. He starts off by creating the section where it says one size fits all, and he just starts by explaining that this idea of 8 hours of sleep is the incorrect way of thinking about things. He says it's a bit of a myth, and the reason why he says that is they recommend, or people get 8 hours of sleep on average a day, but thinking of sleep in 8-hour blocks is an incorrect way of doing things. Like I said, 8 hours is the average amount, but really our sleep occurs in cycles, and he refers this to as a polyphasic sleep routine. So that our 8-hour or 9-hour block of sleep is broken up into multiple phases of sleep, and so we need to start looking at how many cycles of sleep we get in one night as opposed to one solid hour or one big chunk of 8 hours of sleep. So his analogy that he uses, he says this one size fits all mentality with sleep, or recommending that everyone should get 8 hours, is just an incongruent way. If we think about when we're recommending diets to people, really we work out the number of calories that you need based on your weight and your gender and the amount of exercise you're doing. So why is it any different with sleep? Some individuals will only require 4 hours, some people may require 10, and it's just across that spectrum it can be very different. He also mentions that our sleep requirements are going to change throughout our life. We've already touched on that, where in your early childhood you may need a lot more sleep, and then in your adolescent years you might tend to have less sleep and sleep later and that kind of thing. And so he kind of lays out these general ranges here, saying that a teenager tends to need 8 to 10 hours of sleep, while an adult may only need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. And then that's when he starts really talking about that polyphasic idea of sleep. The whole idea is that sleep really occurs in different cycles. So he has this whole thing called the R90 sleep recovery system, and the R90 actually stands for recovery in 90 minutes. All right. And so the reason why he uses this 90 minutes or the R90 is that under clinical conditions, the average person is going to take 90 minutes to get through all the stages of one cycle of sleep. This one cycle of sleep is going to be composed of 4, sometimes 5 stages of sleep. The author uses this analogy of going down the stairs as a metaphor. The whole idea is that when at the top of the stairs you're in the lighter phases of sleep, and then as you go down the stairs it's into a deeper, darker state where you like completely in your deep sleep and into the REM cycles and that kind of thing. So for the next part of this chapter, he goes into a bit more detail about the different stages of sleep. I thought it would be best just to do a quick screencast here of a diagram that I put together that will actually summarize the information that he put together in this section. If you head on over to the screen over here, you'll see we have the heading over here, which is the sleep cycles. To get started, we'll take a look at the first stage, which is technically known as the non-REM stage of sleep. The author uses an analogy of going down the stairs, and he says that this stage of sleep will be when you are at the top of the stairs, and this could be when you're dozing off, you're starting to fall off to sleep. This is known as non-REM stage 1 sleep. And he mentions that it's somewhere between the wakeful and the sleepful state, and it's quite easy to actually exit this stage if there is a loud noise in your environment, something that disturbs you. You can very easily exit this stage of sleep and become awake again. Moving on to the next stage that he describes, as you're moving down the stairs, towards the middle part of the stairs, you would reach this stage of light sleep, which is known as non-REM sleep stage 2, and this is where your body temperature will actually begin to drop and your heart rate actually slows. There are physiological differences now that are starting to differentiate between the different stage or stage 1. At this stage, you could still easily be brought back into stage 1 with a loud shout or someone calling your name. It might wake you up and then put you back into stage 1. The author mentions that we spend most of our time in this sleep state. So in stage 2 non-REM, we'll be spending most of our sleep time in. And what's interesting is that our information consolidation and motor skill performances are linked to this stage. So any improvements, anything that we learned during that day, whether that be, reading something, something cognitively demanding or even something physically demanding, we will consolidate all this information. It will kind of be learned into our nervous system, and this is the stage where that kind of progress is made. Right, and as we reach the bottom of the stairs, according to his analogy, this would be what we call deep sleep, and this would be non-REM sleep, stage 3 and sometimes stage 4. And at this stage, it will really take a big effort or something really quite loud or quite intense to wake you out of this state. It is at this stage that sleepwalkers actually take to the floor. So once a person, if they are prone to or prevalent to doing to be a sleepwalker, move around at night, it is when they're in deep sleep that this would occur. The dominant brainwave frequency that is being emitted at this time is delta waves, and so these are those slow frequency waves that are being produced by your brain, and so that is how we would actually know you have reached this deep sleep state. Alright, and so most of the time in this specific stage we will reap the most benefits, so the trade-off of time in this stage compared to the amount of physiological benefits are going to be drastically increased compared to the other stages. This is where we also have human growth hormone being naturally secreted at its most or highest levels in this deep sleep state, and it is noted that we spend 20% of our time in deep sleep. In this last stage, he calls this helter-skelter, and this is kind of a reference to the dream state. This is the REM, or the rapid eye movement stage of sleep. He mentions that infants spend half of their sleep time in this stage, and it is at the end of this stage, or when we are finished with REM sleep, that we kind of take the ride back up to the top stage, and then we repeat this cycle over and over again throughout the night. And I guess that's what he's trying to outline here, the polyphasic nature of our sleep. So we'll be dropping from stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 into this REM sleep. When we're done with this stage, we move back, and this typically takes 90 minutes, right? As he mentions in the book. So for an average person, 20% of our time is spent in this REM sleep stage. I have mentioned that this is the rapid eye movement. That's what the REM stands for. The helter-skelter that he mentions, the dream state, this is where most of our dreaming, or this is where we will enter into the dream state, and we most often do not actually remember anything from this state. And there is a paralysis effect that occurs in REM sleep, and this actually physiologically happens so that you don't actually act out what you're dreaming. So your mind is kind of doing its own thing in the dream state, and then your body completely shuts down, and so that prevents you from acting out your dreams and doing anything dangerous or stupid that might harm you or those around you. And there are sleep disorders where this paralysis doesn't occur, and people end up doing some weird things during sleep. Anyway, last point here for the REM sleep is that it is said to increase creativity. So the time spent in this stage will help you improve your creativity if that is something that you are working on during your creative or during your wakeful state. This is where that consolidation of your creativity will occur. So that's it for this quick screencast that I wanted to show you, this diagram that I put together. We'll move on to the next section of this chapter. The last section of this chapter, quite a big one. He titles this section, he says wake up with the exclamation mark, and he kind of just outlines some things that we need to take note of. And the first thing that he's really trying to hammer home is that our modern day lifestyle needs a much more flexible approach. And so instead of becoming fixated on trying to get 8 hours of sleep at night, he's kind of saying what we need to do is look at it on a bigger time scale, maybe a week, and see how many cycles of sleep we get in a particular week, and focus our attention on that as opposed to getting fixated on one night of rest. And so in order to have some sort of flexibility, he recommends that you have a fixed wake time. So that means that you're going to wake up at the same time every day. With that being the kind of peg in the ground, we can vary the amount of cycles we sleep or we get in a night in order to create that flexibility in the system. So some nights we only get maybe 4 cycles of sleep, and some nights we get 6-hour cycles of sleep, and it's all dependent on our lifestyle, because as we know, life does get in the way, and we don't want to live in this rigid way where it's like, okay, we have to go to bed at a certain time every single night. On the weekends we have social engagements, sometimes we have to work late and get things done, and so we need a more flexible approach in our modern lifestyle. That's kind of the point of what he's saying. He kind of reiterates the idea of our body operating on circadian rhythms. He's just saying, now that he says you must fix your wake time, he's trying to say your body rises, wakes up during the day and goes to bed during the night. And so try and fix or set your wake time as close to the sunrise as possible. So if you are a PMer, so if your chronotype is more of a PM or late night person, you may consider setting your wake time a bit later. But just from a practical point of view, says what is the earliest time you need to wake up during the week, in terms of what time you need to get to work or get your kids to school or take your pet out for a walk or whatever. That should be the time that you set as your constant wake time. So whether that's 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m., just make sure that it's not like a variable wake time. He does recommend something interesting here, saying that ideally you want your wake time to be 90 minutes before any real work needs to be done. So if you need to be at work by 9 o'clock, he's saying you should be awake at 7:30, giving yourself time to kind of fire up the engines and really get awake and alert and well hydrated before you actually start doing anything cognitively demanding. So that's an interesting point. And so the next kind of thing that he's working through here is he's saying once you have your fixed wake time, you need to work back in 90-minute cycles. So those are the 90-minute sleep cycles. And so 5 of these cycles is going to equal 7.5 hours of sleep. 6 of these 90-minute cycles will equal 9 hours of sleep. So he recommends working backwards. So if you need to wake up at 5 a.m. and you want to start with 5 cycles of sleep, then your bedtime will be 9 or 9:30. And if you were going to go to bed at 11, then you'd only get 4 cycles. And if you went to bed at 8 p.m., you'd get 6 cycles. So that's how you would vary or create that flexibility within your sleeping routine. So he's quite empathetic about, he goes on about this quite a bit, but he says, don't try and catch up sleep. If you had a bad night's sleep, don't try and sleep in and catch it up in that way. It's not going to work. He's just saying, get up, go about your day, and then try and get an extra hour or an extra cycle of sleep later in the week, and don't get fixated on trying to catch up sleep when it's been lost. And that leads on to this point where he's talking about scheduling your sleep. He says there's a big problem with some people who are stressing or they struggle to fall off to sleep and they really get stressed out about it. He says this is like a downward spiral because that process is going to release even more stress hormones, and it's just going to increase your alertness and just keep you awake even more, and then you get more stressed, and it's just like this bad cycle. Kind of reiterates the point of don't worry about one night of sleep. You should be more focused on how many cycles of sleep you get in 1 week. And as a recommendation, he lays out a plan that you should be aiming to get 35 cycles of sleep in a week. And so if in some days you're working late or you've got social engagements, whatever, and you're only getting four cycles in that night, then plan to get six cycles of sleep, which would be 9 hours of sleep, maybe in the other 4 nights to try and just kind of balance that out and hit your target of 35 cycles of sleep in a week. And he's just saying he finds this a lot easier to deal with when he's working with his athletes. If they have late away games, then they can kind of schedule out their week and plan to get in those 35, and it just gives him and his athletes a lot more flexibility around that. So in terms of his suggestions around trying to find the right number of cycles of sleep for you in particular, he says start with those 5 cycles of sleep a night. And so what you would do is set your wake time, adjust your sleep time, and then for 7 solid days, stick to that, see how you're feeling. And then what he says is move to either 6 or 4. So for the next 7 days, move to six cycles a night. So that's going to be 9 hours of sleep, and see if you feel any better or any worse. If you feel any worse, move to 4 hours. So that'll be, not 4 hours, 4 cycles of sleep. So that'll be 6 hours of sleep. And you never know, he says you'd be surprised that you might even feel much better with the 60 or the 4 cycles of sleep, or it could be 6 or it could be 5. So it's just something that you kind of need to experiment with, a bit of trial and error. And that's it for chapter